The North Atlantic in the spring of 1941 was a killing ground unlike any the world had ever seen. German U-boats prowled these waters with lethal efficiency, their radio operators constantly transmitting encrypted messages through devices that the Germans believed were utterly unbreakable. The Enigma machine, with its staggering 158 quintillion possible combinations, had turned naval warfare into a nightmare for the Allies. Every coded transmission represented potential death for Allied merchant seamen. Every successful convoy ambush brought Britain one step closer to starvation, and every sunken cargo ship carrying vital supplies pushed the possibility of British defeat closer to reality. But there was something else transmitting across those freezing gray waters, something that seemed far more mundane than battle orders or submarine positions. Weather data. Simple, unglamorous reports about wind speeds, barometric pressure, and sea conditions. These transmissions came from specially designated German weather ships, converted fishing trawlers that bobbed innocently in the hostile waters between Iceland and Greenland. To the casual observer, these vessels appeared to be exactly what they claimed to be: weathered fishing boats going about their legitimate business. Yet beneath this civilian facade, each weather ship carried sophisticated Enigma equipment and code books, dutifully reporting atmospheric conditions that would help German forces predict weather patterns across the entire Atlantic theater. The British Admiralty had noticed these transmissions. More importantly, they had noticed a pattern. Unlike combat vessels that could be anywhere, weather ships had to remain in relatively fixed positions to provide consistent meteorological data. They were predictable. They were vulnerable. And in May of 1941, the Royal Navy decided to exploit this weakness in what would become one of the most consequential operations of the entire war, though no one could possibly have predicted its ultimate impact. On the 7th of May, 1941, the destroyer HMS Somali spotted the German weather ship München southeast of Iceland. What followed was a desperate race against time. The British warship bore down on the vulnerable trawler with deadly intent, her guns already trained on the target. Aboard the München, the German crew reacted with the practiced efficiency of men who knew exactly what classified materials they carried. As the first shells screamed overhead, sailors frantically began throwing equipment overboard. The Enigma machine itself vanished into the depths, sent to the bottom rather than risk capture. Current code books followed, their weighted pages spinning down into the black water. But panic creates mistakes, and in their haste, the German crew made a critical error. They threw overboard only June's current operational codes. Hidden somewhere in the chaos aboard that doomed vessel was something far more valuable: the complete set of Enigma settings for July. When British sailors clambered aboard the München before she sank, they discovered this intelligence treasure trove intact. The material was immediately rushed back to Bletchley Park, the ultra-secret British code-breaking facility where mathematicians and cryptanalysts had been struggling for months to crack naval Enigma. The haul from the München was extraordinary, but British naval intelligence knew they needed more. Weather ships operated on monthly code cycles, meaning that each captured month's worth of keys opened only a limited window into German communications. 3 weeks after the München operation, on the 28th of June, 1941, the Royal Navy struck again. This time, the target was the weather ship Lauenburg, operating north of Iceland in the perpetual twilight of Arctic summer. The operation proceeded with surgical precision. HMS Tartar intercepted the vessel, and before the German crew could complete their destruction protocols, British boarding parties had seized complete Enigma materials, including the full settings for the upcoming month. These captures transformed the war at sea. The intelligence gathered from these seemingly insignificant fishing trawlers allowed Bletchley Park to read German naval communications with unprecedented speed and accuracy. Suddenly, the positions of U-boat wolf packs became known. Convoy routes could be adjusted to avoid submarine concentrations. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had threatened to strangle Britain's lifeline to America, began to turn in favor of the Allies. But there was another consequence of these weathership captures, one that wouldn't become apparent for 3 more years, one that would ultimately play a decisive role in the most important amphibious invasion in human history. The capture and systematic destruction of German weather ships had created an invisible wound in the Wehrmacht's intelligence infrastructure. By mid-1944, the Germans had lost their forward weather observation network in the North Atlantic. The weather stations in Greenland had been raided and destroyed by Allied forces. The trawlers had been sunk or captured. Even the U-boats assigned to weather reporting duties faced relentless hunting by Allied aircraft and surface vessels. The German Meteorological Service, once capable of tracking weather systems as they formed over the Atlantic and moved eastward toward Europe, had essentially been blinded. This blindness mattered enormously because weather in the European theater doesn't simply appear out of nowhere. The massive low-pressure systems that bring storms to the English Channel formed days earlier, hundreds of miles to the west over the Atlantic Ocean. To predict what conditions will be like over France in 48 hours, you need to know what's happening over the mid-Atlantic today. The Allies, with their weather stations in Iceland, their reconnaissance flights over the ocean, and their network of weather observation ships, possessed this capability. The Germans, by mid-1944, largely did not. The stage was now set for one of history's most critical weather forecasts. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower had assembled the largest invasion force ever gathered, more than 150,000 men aboard 6,000 ships, all poised to strike at Nazi-occupied France. But this massive operation required specific weather conditions: low winds to allow landing craft to reach the beaches, adequate cloud breaks for air support to be effective, and calm seas for the soldiers who would have to wade through surf under murderous fire. The operation had been planned for the 5th of June, 1944, but Group Captain James Stagg, the chief Allied meteorologist, saw trouble brewing. On the evening of June 4th, 1944, Stagg delivered devastating news to Eisenhower and his senior commanders. A major storm system was bearing down on the English Channel. Conditions on June 5th would be utterly unsuitable for invasion: high winds, rough seas, low clouds that would blind the aircraft. The invasion force, some elements already at sea, was ordered to stand down and return to port. The postponement created a crisis. These massive forces could not be kept ready indefinitely. Security was already a nightmare, with tens of thousands of men knowing an invasion was imminent. Every day of delay increased the risk of German discovery. But Stagg had seen something in his weather data, something subtle tracking across the Atlantic. Behind the storm system currently lashing the channel, there appeared to be a brief window of relatively calmer weather. Not perfect conditions by any means, but potentially adequate. On the evening of June 4th, with rain drumming against the windows of his headquarters, Stagg told Eisenhower that if they waited one more day, if they launched on June 6th instead of June 5th, they might just catch this window. The Supreme Commander faced an agonizing decision. If Stagg was wrong, if the weather didn't improve, thousands of men would die in the surf, and the invasion could end in catastrophic failure. But if they delayed any further, the tides and moon conditions wouldn't be right again for weeks, possibly months. Meanwhile, in Paris, German Luftwaffe meteorologist Professor Walter Stube was making his own forecast. Looking at the limited data available from European weather stations, Stube saw only one thing: the massive storm system currently pounding the channel. Without access to Atlantic observations, Without the weathership network that had been systematically destroyed over the previous 3 years, Stuba had no way of seeing the calmer conditions developing behind that storm. His forecast was unequivocal. The bad weather would continue for days. An invasion was meteorologically impossible. This German forecast had immediate consequences. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in Normandy, decided the weather was so bad that he could safely leave his post and travel to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. Other senior German commanders relaxed their alert status. Some units were even sent on training exercises away from the coast. After all, no one would be insane enough to launch an invasion in such terrible weather. The German defensive network, which might have responded with devastating efficiency to an invasion alert, was effectively stood down based on a weather forecast that was about to prove catastrophically wrong. At 0630 hours on June 6, 1944, the first Allied troops hit the beaches of Normandy. Stagg's forecast had been accurate enough. The weather was far from ideal, with winds still strong enough to make the landing craft difficult to handle and seas rough enough to make thousands of men violently seasick before they even reached the shore. But it was workable. More importantly, it was unexpected. The Germans, completely surprised by an invasion they had assumed was meteorologically impossible, were caught utterly unprepared. The U-boat force based in French ports along the Bay of Biscay suddenly faced a desperate situation. 43 submarines were ordered to attack the invasion fleet, to create the kind of devastating losses that might give German ground forces time to drive the Allies back into the sea. But these U-boats had to transit through waters now completely dominated by Allied air power. Without accurate weather forecasting, the submarines surfaced into conditions they hadn't properly anticipated. Allied aircraft, taking advantage of the breaks in the weather that Stagg had predicted, caught the U-boats on the surface again and again. The results were catastrophic for the German submarine force. Between D-Day and late June, the U-boats attempting to reach the invasion zone were systematically destroyed. Some never even made it out of the Bay of Biscay, caught by patrolling aircraft while still in transit. Those that did reach the channel found themselves operating in a shooting gallery, hunted by destroyers, aircraft, and coastal forces that had been positioned based on excellent intelligence and weather forecasting. The famous U-boat threat, which had nearly strangled Britain just 2 years earlier, proved almost completely ineffective against the D-Day fleet, and it all traced back to those weather ship captures 3 years before. The München and the Lauenburg, two modest fishing trawlers that most historians barely mention, had ultimately helped create the conditions for Allied victory. By compromising German weather forecasting capabilities, those captures had contributed to one of the most important strategic surprises of the entire war. The Germans had been blinded twice. First, by the loss of their codes, and later by the loss of their ability to see what weather was coming across the Atlantic. The story of how weather forecasting influenced D-Day is occasionally told, usually focusing on James Stagg's accurate prediction or on the dramatic decision Eisenhower faced. But the deeper story, the 3-year chain of events that began with the capture of German weather ships in 1941 and culminated in German meteorological blindness in June of 1944, remains largely unknown outside specialist military history circles. There are no monuments to the weather ship operations. The sailors who captured the München and Lauenburg received no medals comparable to those given for conventional combat victories. The connection between these early captures and the success of D-Day went unrecognized for decades. Yet this forgotten chapter of the war offers profound lessons about how conflicts are actually won. Warfare is not simply about who has the most tanks or the bravest soldiers. It's about information, about logistics, about the hundreds of seemingly minor advantages that accumulate over time to create decisive moments, A fishing trawler captured in May of 1941 helped make possible the liberation of Europe in June of 1944. The seemingly mundane business of weather forecasting proved as important as any battlefield victory. Consider the compounding nature of these advantages. The Enigma materials captured from the weather ships helped crack German codes, which allowed Allied forces to hunt more weather ships and U-boats, which further degraded German intelligence capabilities, which made Allied convoy routing more effective, which strengthened the buildup of forces in Britain, which made a larger invasion possible, which required more sophisticated weather forecasting, which the Germans could no longer match because they'd lost their Atlantic observation network 3 years earlier. Each advantage built upon the previous one in a cascading chain of consequences that the Germans could neither anticipate nor counter. This same pattern plays out in modern conflicts and challenges. The side that controls information, that can see further and predict more accurately, possesses an advantage that multiplies across every other dimension of competition. Today's military forces spend enormous resources on satellite reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and data analysis, understanding that information superiority creates the conditions for victory before the shooting even starts. The weather ships of 1941 were an early example of this principle, though no one fully understood it at the time. In the end, the story of D-Day weather forecasting is really a story about invisible chains of causation, about how small actions in 1 year create decisive consequences years later. When HMS Somali bore down on the München on that May morning in 1941, no one aboard that destroyer could have imagined they were participating in events that would help ensure the success of an invasion still 3 years in the future. When British sailors hauled captured code books from the sinking Lauenburg, they knew they'd won an intelligence victory, but they couldn't foresee how the destruction of the weathership network would blind German meteorologists at the most critical moment of the entire European war. This is how wars are actually won, not just through headline-grabbing battles and stirring speeches, but through the patient accumulation of advantages, through exploiting enemy weaknesses that may take years to fully manifest, through understanding that every system has dependencies that can be attacked. The Germans had built their Atlantic weather forecasting on a network of trawlers and U-boats, assuming these humble vessels were too insignificant to matter strategically. They were catastrophically wrong. When the moment came that required absolutely accurate weather prediction, when the success or failure of the entire liberation of Europe hung on whether meteorologists could spot a brief window in stormy weather, the Germans simply couldn't see what was coming. They had been blinded years before and never realized the full implications of that blindness until it was far too late. The U-boats that sortied against the D-Day fleet were destroyed not primarily by the ships and aircraft that sank them in June of 1944, but by the operations against weather ships in 1941 that had created the conditions for their destruction. This is the true genius of effective warfare, recognizing which seemingly small actions will create overwhelming advantages when the decisive moment finally arrives. The capture of 2 fishing trawlers in the spring and summer of 1941 helped drown a German U-boat fleet in the summer of 1944. Between those 2 events lay 3 years of accumulated consequences that changed the course of human history.